Hello knitters, Barbara Benson here. I'm an independent knitwear designer who also likes to make videos here on my YouTube channel, Watch Barbara Knit. Make sure to check in the description below where you will find links to all my social media outlets. You can find where you can get one of my patterns, learn how to sign up for the Watch Barbara Knit Facebook group, and how to support me on Patreon. Today, my discussion has been inspired by, on Facebook, like many of you, I am a member of quite a few different knitting groups where they follow and people comment and post awesome pictures of their beautiful work, and it's very inspirational. But another reason I am on them is because they frequently have knitting questions. And if I can help, I try to help, but it also helps me tune into and hone in on questions that people might have. And there was one that popped up that got me thinking about knitting homophones. Now, I know most of y'all probably know what a homophone is, but I also know that I have quite a few viewers who English might not be their first language. So a homophone is a word that is pronounced or spelled the same, but has different meanings, like bow and bow. And like a bow is a bow in your hair, bow is the bow of a ship, or bowing. I mean, English makes a lot of words do double, even, triple duty. And there are some places where it can get confusing in knitting because the same word can mean different things depending on the context. And this specific question was in regards to vintage patterns. And you can get into a lot of confusing areas in vintage patterns because they were written under the assumption that you have a lot more knowledge than a lot of modern knitters have. Most of us didn't start knitting at 3 years old and just know how to do things. But the first one I wanted to talk about is quite possibly the most common word in knitting, which is knit. And you would think, hey, knit means knit. And yes, it does. When you are reading a pattern and it says like K1, that means knit. And sometimes it'll just say row whatever, knit. But other times knit is used in a generic way to simply mean knitting. And I know that doesn't make a lot of sense, but if you're working in stockinette and you run into an older pattern, it might have like a pattern on one side and then it'll just say knit 5 rows. And what they mean by that is you're going to have to knit the right sides and purl the wrong sides because that gives you stockinette, but they're using knitting and the general term you are knitting, not doing the knit stitch. I know that's kind of brain breaking, but it does happen. They're using knit in the term that encompasses everything that you might be doing. A more common way for it to be phrased in more modern patterns is something like continue in pattern or work straight. And what those things mean is you just keep on doing what you've been doing previously, but don't increase or decrease. So if you're doing ribbing and it says, or a texture or a moss stitch, and it just says continue in pattern, that means you're going to work the right side rows the way you've been working the right side rows and the wrong side rows where you've been working the wrong side rows. But in older and more vintage patterns, it might just say knit for 3 inches. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're wanting you to work garter. If you're working flat, it might be that it's supposed to be stockinette. And here is where looking at pictures might actually help you in getting an idea of what the actual context of it is. So what I'm saying is knit most of the time means do a knit stitch, but sometimes it can say knit the next 6 stitches, but what it means is work those next few stitches in pattern, and some of them may be knits and some of them may be purls. It's confusing, I know. And again, I just wanted to bring it up. So look at the images of the finished object and try to suss it out in context. In a modern pattern, you shouldn't run into these issues, but like the Victoria and Albert Museum has put a bunch of vintage patterns, and if you get into older patterns, they're going to have these types of instructions, and you might want to watch out for them. They'll also have super fun things, like they'll tell you how to knit one side of a sweater, and they'll say knit the other side but reverse shaping. And then you're going to have to mentally flip everything, and that can get super confusing. So that's the first one, is knit. Homophones. Sometimes it means knit stitch. Sometimes it just means the generic act of knitting. The next one I wanted to talk about is weight. Weight can mean, and most of the time when someone says weight, they're talking about the yarn weight. And which this means is the thickness, how heavy that yarn is, where you've got super thin yarn that is going to be like a fingering weight or a lace weight. Average, when you're getting into worsted weight, and bulky, which is a heavy weight yarn. They're talking about the actual diameter of the tiny piece of yarn that you're looking at. I mean, because none of them, even bulky, none of them are particularly big. But if you would like bust out your micrometer and figure out how big it is, that's the weight. But you could also be talking about the weight of the skein itself. How much fiber does that skein contain? Is it 100 grams? The actual weight of your skein. So we're talking about is the weight of the yarn, as in the thickness, versus the weight of the skein or hank, which is, how much of it there is. Lightweight. So that one can get confusing. And I think for a lot of beginning knitters, they default. So if I say something like what weight yarn, and especially new knitters who come into the store, and I'll say what weight yarn do they want? And they'll be like, oh, I want 100 grams. But that's not what I'm asking you. I'm not asking how much you want. I'm asking what is the size of the yarn that you want, as far as how skinny or fat is it. So that's a weight. Weight is a homophone because it can mean two different things. And then the last one is your favorite subject and mine, gauge. Gauge can mean a couple different things when you're talking about it in knitting. First off, this is a gauge. Okay? It is a needle gauge. It is a device with which you can use to measure what gauge your needles are, which is what is the diameter or circumference of your needle. It is also a gauge for measuring your gauge. So you use the gauge to measure your gauge, which is ridiculous. And what that gauge is what is your knitting gauge. When you do a swatch, how many stitches and rows or rounds per inch you are getting with those needles and that yarn in that pattern. So you have a gauge, which is a device for measuring. A ruler is a gauge. You have wraps per inch gauges. It is how you measure something. And then you have your knitting gauge, which is when you take your needles and your yarn and you knit in that pattern, how many stitches per inch and how many rows around per inch you're getting. Now, in the United Kingdom and some European countries, they don't actually call it a gauge swatch. They call it a tension swatch, which in a way is a little bit more logical because what your gauge is or what those measurements are is dependent on how much tension you put onto your yarn, how much tension your knitting is under. So if we're looking at older patterns, or if you're looking at a pattern that was written for a European or United Kingdom market, instead of saying your gauge, it might say tension. And the tension means, again, it's number of stitches per, in this case, most likely centimeters, and number of rows or rounds per 10 centimeters. That is going to be your tension. In the US, that is called gauge, which is not to be confused with the gauge that you use to measure your tension or gauge, or the gauge of your needles. I am confident that I've cleared everything up for y'all. It is. It gets a little confusing, and the number one thing is context. Listen to the context or read the context of how the information is being presented to you, because that will give you clues what is being meant. And hopefully this clears up a few questions. Now, you know what? There's no such thing as a bad or a stupid question. And it's one of the reasons I lurk on these knitting boards and groups and things, is because I want to see where the confusion lies. Because for a lot of knitters and people like me who are designers or teachers who are further along in their acquisition of knowledge and experience, it's easy to forget the things that tripped us up when we were getting started. And it's easy to assume certain things are just known by everybody. And honestly, that's not fair. So that's why I watch these things and listen to these things and do things like that. So if there are any questions or any things that you have been stumbling across that just seem to be taken for granted, that you know what it is and you're just like, I have no idea what they're talking about, let me know. Comment in the comments below and let me know, or come over to the Facebook group and ask the question. And if I can accumulate enough of these things, I can make more videos explaining things like this, because it's not a stupid question and there's no reason you should already know these things if you're just getting started, or even if you've been doing it for a while and it's just always been confusing. Because if nobody explains it, then how are you supposed to know? I mean, sometimes you just find things out the hard way, and that's how I've done most things. But it's good to learn and always keep on learning and growing. So if you like this video, please give it the thumbs up, click that like button. And if you would like to be notified whenever I upload a new video, please subscribe to my channel and select notifications. Thank you so much.